welcome to another Rock My Age podcast in our series Inspiring Women, Conversations with Inspiring Women. Today I am with Liz Rivers, and Liz and I found so many things in common to talk about when we first chatted. So I'm delighted that she has agreed to join the podcast series. Liz was started out life or career, should I say, as a litigation lawyer. She's also a trained psychotherapist. She focuses on, a lot of her work focuses on embodied leadership and somatic work, which I certainly share and have experiences in, both my own equine facilitated human development and my own coaching. So we share a lot of those thoughts, beliefs and principles in common. Liz has two businesses that she is involved with. The first is with a colleague of hers, and that is called Power, Purpose and Presence. And those are three themes that both Debbie and I work with throughout our Rock My Age conversations and our own coaching. And Liz also is part of a business called Together Team, which is about helping women and men work more effectively together and to think about the types of conversations that support positive gender relationships. And I think right now, coming out of a very dark week with the very sad murder and death of Sarah Everard, Liz and I thought that we would firstly focus on the conversation around the gender, effective gender working relationships. And we are actually putting this podcast into two parts because we have so much to talk around this idea of both gender relationships and this idea of power, purpose and presence, which are also fantastic subjects and themes to talk about. So this first podcast is going to be around this idea of helping find ways, practical ways, perhaps as well as some philosophical aspects of helping women and men work effectively together. So welcome, Liz.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to talking to you about this.
So I think the first thing might be just interesting to understand a little bit about your journey, because I know you and I spoke about this idea of kind of coming from perhaps quite a rational and perhaps quite a sort of hard or brutal work environment in law and moving into this idea of embodied leadership, and then how you transitioned and really established this idea of Together Team and the importance of that. And then perhaps we can talk about, you know, what is happening right this week and the sorts of conversations we should be having around this subject.
Yes, thank you. I guess if I think back over the journey through my career, I can see two very distinct strands that have always been running through my life. So as a child, I loved nature, I loved fairy tales and stories and playing in the woods, and I was lucky enough to grow up at a time when children did have a relative amount of freedom. And yet at school, I could see that being good at exams and was the sort of thing that gave you status. So I was drawn towards studying law at university rather than something more imaginative because I saw it as a high status subject. And I then went on to practice as a lawyer for about 10 years in the City of London, and I was a litigator. So it was like the epitome of alpha law, all about competitiveness and winning and arguing and being right and being an individual star and being the best advocate. And part of me was attracted to the drama of it, but I could also see that this was actually bringing out the worst in people. You know, it was a terrible way of resolving differences. And we spent thousands of pounds of people and organisations' money, and then usually ended up with a muddy compromise at the end of it. So one day I went to a talk about mediation and had a complete road to Damascus moment when I thought, oh, this is great. You just get people to sit down, you ask them in a non-judgmental space what's really going on, what really matters to them and what they want and how they feel about the situation and how they see it. And then you facilitate a dialogue between everybody and you sort it out in a day and everybody goes away satisfied or at least able to put things behind them. So it's a complete no-brainer to me that this is how business and other disputes should be resolved. And I couldn't understand why everybody else couldn't see that as well. So I trained as a mediator. I was actually the first woman in the UK to train as a commercial mediator and accredit. And then some years later, once I'd plotted my escape route, I jumped ship from being a lawyer and gave up in one fell swoop both the only job I'd done for 10 years, the only profession I'd been in the law, and being an employee. So I went straight to being self-employed, setting up in business as a mediator, when frankly nobody was earning a living as a mediator. So, and yet, as I look back, I can see that in a way, I feel there was a sort of feminine values that mediation embodied for me, about listening, about mutual respect, about receptivity, about valuing everybody's point of views, collaborating, recognising subjective felt experience as well as objective criteria. And it felt like it was really important to bring this work into the workplace and into organisations.
And did that link then to, I know both setting up your own business from there on the coaching piece and leadership piece, but then also this idea of Together Team. So I was fascinated that Together Team is 2 women and 2 men as a team. And I imagine that that's quite important to have that balance when you're having those sorts of conversations.
Absolutely, yeah. So fast forward through my career, and I've probably had about 4 careers, I would say at least. So I trained as a psychotherapist, took that into coaching, started coaching in organisations, mediating conflict within teams in organisations. And then probably about 7 years ago, just as I felt there was a second wave of feminism coming back into the workplace, and in my late 50s, I'm old enough to remember the 70s and 80s feminism, when we were very angry with men, and there was a real sort of adversarial nature to how feminism was expressed at that time, which was maybe what was needed at that time. And then in the 90s, really everything went a bit quiet, and yeah, we had this sort of second wave of feminism, which you could say was typified very much by Sheryl Sandberg and Lean In and those sorts of books. And that there's a sense of, yes, we need to put the spotlight on women's issues and gender issues, and let's find a way to do that in partnership with men rather than in opposition. So Hetty Einzig and I set up Purpose, Power, Presence and started running programs for women, and really creating a space that women could step into to say, you know, we have these what we call alpha normal workplaces, where what you could think of as sort of hyper masculine values are upheld. So it's all about logic, rationality, analysis, speed, competitiveness. These are the things that are generally valued in organisations. We wanted to create a space for women to say, well, actually, is that the sort of leader I want to be? Is there another way of doing things? Let's step out of the day-to-day and come on almost like a sort of mini retreat and reflect on, who am I, what's important to me, what's my purpose, what do I derive power from, which is power with, not power over, and how am I going to take those ideas out into the world and have presence in a way that people are going to listen to what I say and act on what I say. So we started running these programs, you know, got really fantastic feedback, you know, women really had a very powerful transformative process, and it had a big effect on them individually and, say, as team leaders. But what we started to see after a few years was that although we could work with women, if we were really going to shift organisations and sectors and society, that we had to engage men. We had to engage all the different elements in the system and really engage men as allies. So Hetty and I teamed up with 2 male coaches, Neil Scott and Alistair Scott, who were very successfully running big change programs in organisations. So we knew that they really understood about systemic change, and they were really interested in working on this. And so we founded Together Team, specifically with the mission of working with organisations to help them have deep, constructive conversations between men and women around gender in the workplace that get beyond platitudes, political correctness, but that are beyond blame and shame also, so that the participants can all be really honest.
And this is really important, isn't it, Liz, around this not blaming and shaming, because, you know, we have to find a way to, you know, live, whether it's in workplace or outside of work, in our home lives and personal lives and family lives. We have to find ways to work together peacefully and with a non-judgment. How easy or difficult has it been to, I suppose, first start these conversations in the business world? And also, is there a sense that men do see that there are kind of issues and have been issues, particularly, I suppose, over centuries, this patriarch sort of energy and the system that has created more of a kind of alpha male workplace. Do they see that as an issue for women?
I think it varies. I think some do and some don't. And I'm glad you raised the question of patriarchy, because I think there's a really important distinction that I make between patriarchy, which is a system, and men who operate within that system. And I believe that we're all victims of patriarchy, and I think men suffer, and they suffer in different ways. So, and I feel a lot of empathy for the challenges that men grapple with, and I want to be in a space where I can show and share that empathy. And it's really interesting. I've gone back to my bookcase and pulled off a load of books that have really shaped my thinking around patriarchy and the evolutionary phase that we're in at the moment. And I think we're coming to an extent the end of a long phase, perhaps sort of 3.5 to 5,000 years of patriarchy, where these sorts of alpha normal values have been in the ascendancy. And before that, there were times in many cultures which were far more egalitarian, and women had a lot of power, and societies were matrilineal. And that's sort of, we don't really hear about that history, but it's there. And I really recommend the work of Riane Eisler, who wrote a seminal book called The Chalice and the Blade. Maybe we can put some of these references in the notes.
Perfect. Well,
Anne Baring, who wrote The Dream of the Cosmos, another really powerful book, where she talks about that we've had a long phase of prehistory when women were very central to society. We've had this patriarchy for the last 3,000 to 5,000 years. It's not about flipping back to female domination. It's how do we knit the two together, and it's both a hugely challenging but a hugely exciting time. And I think one of the key tasks of the time that we're living in now, for us to engage with this.
Do you find there's a difference in maybe just in the workplace for now around the generations? So I suppose in some ways what I see is having worked with a lot of leaders who are perhaps in their 60s, 70s, and actually older, 70s, some have retired, and then the younger generation coming up. And it feels like there's more of less of a sense of patriarchy and men having to think that they have to work within that around this kind of competitive winning environment, and more around a sort of shared agenda and a shared way of kind of win-win together. Did you see that coming through?
Yes, I do think the younger generation perhaps weren't brought up with the baggage that we're brought up with. One of my mentors talks about one of the reasons we have such poor leadership at the moment was birth trauma. The birth practices in the 1950s and 60s were so bad in terms of overuse of cesareans, not breastfeeding, all of these sorts of things. You have a generation of traumatized people in power. So that's a really interesting idea in itself. So I think mostly I see positive shifts in the younger generation, and also I feel that there are things that they have to contend with, particularly around the use of social media, around the possibility to capture images that just weren't on my radar. And I think thank God I didn't have to deal with that when I was a teenager. So I think I see both positive trends and also some disturbing trends that I think are particular challenges for that generation.
And can you elaborate a little bit on that, the disturbing trends? What are you seeing? That's
I would say things like the way that teenagers can bully each other with taking photos of each other, or what's the revenge porn, those sorts of things.
Yeah.
Is just,
and a lot of bullying online. I mean, there isn't there? So yeah, no, that's very good point. So in the workplace, Liz, can you share with us what are the sort of conversations, and perhaps how do they come about in the workplace that begins to help women and men have more effective conversations? And I know things like deep listening, as we talked about, non-judgment, and these sorts of things are so important in having those conversations. But what's coming up in these conversations, and how do you help, I suppose, find a balance in those sorts of things so that it's not a blame and shame?
Absolutely. So it's really important to set very clearly at the outset that it isn't about, yes, shaming anybody or making anybody wrong. It's all about creating spaces where people can speak honestly, they can have their feelings. So it's not about flattening things out and denying feelings. So if somebody feels anger or rage, there's space for that to be expressed in a clean, non-blaming, non-attacking way. So using I statements, I feel, rather than finger pointing, you are. So, and very much about creating a sense of, safety, confidentiality, and that it's not about convincing people or changing people's minds. It's simply about creating spaces to listen. So if I give an example, I was invited into a computer games company to run a session with their mixed team on unconscious bias and inclusive leadership. And the games sector is one that I've worked in a lot. And, they have a particular, or certainly historically have had big challenges around women. They've had relatively small numbers of women. Often a lot of the games have been criticised for being misogynistic in their values and ethos and characters. And there was a big scandal a few years ago when a number of very senior women in the game sector were very badly trolled online. So I was asked into this organisation, and one of the women in the team, a small number of women, had an experience of being sexually harassed by a colleague. And she wanted to talk about this with her colleagues, not to blame them or point the finger, but just say, look, this is what's happened to me. This happened, from a colleague. It had been investigated by HR and dealt with, but she was still left with the residue of it. And what I noticed is whenever it came up in conversation around the table, it was the guys would, I think, just feel quite defensive, and they would tend to say, well, that's not me, and I don't do that, and I don't think that's happening, and sort of try to minimise really what she was saying. And so after a while I said to her, we had a conversation in private, and I said, how about, if you're up for this, that I simply interview you, and I asked the men in the team simply to watch and not feel that you're speaking to them or that they're on the spot to respond. And she was up for this, and I set it up with the men in the room, and they were willing. And I said, you don't have to respond at all. There's no pressure on you. This isn't going to be directed at you. All we're asking is that you simply listen to a conversation between the two of us. So I was able to create a sense of intimacy with her, and we had this conversation. She told me the story, and the guys listened. And then at the end of it, without any prompting, many of them said, gosh, that's really given me something to think about, and I'm going to go away and I'm going to maybe talk to the women in my team and find out what their experience has been. So it's finding, and that was what seemed right in that moment. In another situation, I was working with the global team of it was a worldwide consultancy. They worked mostly remotely, and they were having all coming together physically. This was pre-lockdown for a 2-day team build, and they wanted something on diversity. So we shared some materials with them about unconscious bias, and then split out into men and women. And as soon as then, I was with a male facilitator. So very, very important to work with mixed gender groups. So in that case, we had a man and a woman, and we split out in different groups. And as soon as I was with the women on their own, suddenly this whole well of strong feelings about things that had happened in the organisation, maybe even just simple things like patterns in meetings where who gets the airtime, who gets interrupted. But there was so much strong feeling, and so we facilitated a session where we brought them back together. I said to the men, the women have got some things they want to be able to share with you. Are you willing to listen to this? So made sure that they were up for that. Gave them time for timeouts if they needed that, pauses. And we had an amazing conversation that lasted probably a couple of hours, where a lot of space was given to air things that the women had been sitting on, for the men to respond if they wanted to. And it was a profoundly healing experience. Yeah. So.
And it's interesting, isn't it, this idea of, being able to listen to the other. I've been talking to, after the events of last week, I've been talking to various people, a lot of friends, women friends my age, 50 plus, 60 plus, and also some younger women. And I was talking to a younger woman this weekend who said that a friend of hers had actually asked, the husband had actually asked the wife, what experiences she'd had in her life around feeling unsafe, you know, in society, whether that's walking home at night, whether that's, you know, traveling solo, you know, whatever situation you're in, what did she experience? And he was quite shocked about the number of times she had felt unsafe. And myself, I just put up a piece on Facebook. My sister and I shared over the weekend with our mother, who's 90, just times that we had felt unsafe in our lives, starting from quite young, you know, it's sort of 15, 16 when we first started having adventures out, and perhaps, you know, a little bit late at night and things like that, right up to, you know, today. And it feels like that some of those situations, those experiences are almost secrets we've kept, a little bit sometimes shameful, you know, or ashamed of feeling fear. And maybe sometimes having put ourselves in a situation, you know, we should be able to put ourselves in those situations and not feel fearful. But of course, there's a natural thing that says, oh, you know, should I have gone there? Should I have put myself in that situation? And so I felt like suddenly there was a voice that women, you know, voices that needed to be spoken, needed to be heard. And maybe this is part of the healing also that you say, as long as we can find safe spaces to talk about it, share in a way, as you say, that's no blame and judgment, but that men actually do understand. And I think it was really interesting over the weekend how many people had come forward, men had come forward to say, I didn't realize that kind of walking close behind a woman, you know, maybe in a darker street or something, could be quite frightening. And so I think there's just, it's more like awareness building, isn't it? And education. I don't mean education in a patronizing way. I mean that we need to share these things about what we as women feel. And it's just like in a relationship, isn't it? Saying, look, I feel this, that's mine to own, but if you have an awareness of this, maybe you can help. I don't know if that makes sense.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I look at the journey I went on last year through Black Lives Matter. And that gives me empathy for men, because and when I'm doing unconscious bias trainings, one of the first things I say is, in every category of diversity except gender, I am in the category of privilege. You know, I'm white, I'm middle class, I'm straight, I'm able-bodied, all of these things. So and one of the things that Black Lives Matter did for me is it really, I felt it opened my eyes to my responsibility to find out the experience of people of colour, and that it's not enough simply to be, you know, not overtly racist. I need to be constantly reflecting on my unconscious bias, educating myself, finding out those stories, and actively dismantling white privilege rather than simply not consciously perpetrating it. And I mean, for me, one of the things that happened after the protests, I met up with a friend of mine who I've known her for about 38 years now. We were at university together, and she's mixed race. Her father was from the Caribbean, her mother's English. And, you know, we started talking about her experiences of racism at university and when she was going into law, and she was telling me stories about, you know, going for interviews and realize as soon as she walked in the room, people registering her ethnicity, and it being really obvious that, you know, they weren't going to hire her. And I felt, oh my God, you know, I've known you all this time and I've never asked you about this. And part of me just didn't want to know because it's uncomfortable, because it then shows me my responsibility. And so I've been through, you know, my own shame around that. And then through a conversation with another mixed race friend, realised, okay, that doesn't help, you know, because that's the whole white fragility thing. You know, people of colour end up having to look after white people in the same way that sometimes as a woman I feel I'm taking care of a man when actually I want to express some rage about what's happened. And if the male response is, well, you know, don't tar us all with the same brush, and that isn't me. And some, you know, so those men who are willing to simply listen to my anger, listen to my experience without the need to defend themselves, I have such appreciation for.
What do you think of in that sense, Liz, what are the next steps we could take, practical steps, to have these sorts of conversations, men and women? Some of it could happen in the workplace. You know, do you think there are other situations now, and perhaps particularly right now, there's an opportunity to think about how we do that? Is that through channels where people just air their thoughts in social media and those sort of things? Because of course then you get things can be said short and sharp and not always given the space to talk. What do we think are the channels and the practical ways we can help move this forward?
I think social media is tricky because it's hard to create those pockets of safety. Maybe if you have a closed group and you have a clear ground rules. I'm much more in favour of conversation, whether that's, and that can be done very powerfully virtually. So, and one of the things one of my colleagues, Alistair Scott, has developed is something called compassion practices. And there's a website, compassionpractices.net. We can perhaps share the resource to that, which provides a whole structure for facilitating a dialogue process around sensitive topic. And one of the things we want to do is to really open source these resources and materials and say, here it is, you can download these materials, here's a structure. It was designed initially in mind for teams within the NHS and healthcare who are experiencing burnout. So it's a structure whereby people can debrief at the end of a shift, but realise that actually the methodology can apply to all sorts of things. And it's a way of creating safety, reciprocity, mutual respect and encouraging listening without people trying to convince each other. So I'd say download it, use the materials, maybe set up something in your workplace or your community or in your family and start having these conversations, because we so need to have it. We need to have them around gender, sexual violence against women, around race, around all the racism, all those different topics, all those things that feel edgy and we don't want to go towards because we're afraid of getting it wrong. But there's huge energy tied up in that when we start having those conversations.
And I wonder, actually, listening to you, whether, I mean, like, for example, Rock My Age, we generally interview women, but perhaps for us, it would be a good idea, we could have a mixed gender conversation about this topic. And I think it's almost like you say, it can be at family level, it could be at, there's networks, it could be, communities within society, it can be platforms like us, it doesn't really matter where, does it? But it's just about having these conversations so that it's almost like a ripple effect, isn't it? The more we understand, the more we have compassion, the more we listen,
yes,
the more we're better informed, and the more that we can then understand how these different perspectives play out and then take practical steps to ensure that this sort of thing doesn't happen again. You mentioned a while ago to me also about this lady called Gina Martin, who I was just thinking also about these, I wouldn't say activists, that's the wrong word, but people who have had real passion and, put their time and energy and belief systems into play to create, sort of perhaps different kind of groups, networks. And you said that she set up a group, it was actually to shift policy, wasn't it, on upskirting, and has a great TED talk. Do you want to just talk about that a little bit?
So Gina Martin's a young woman who was at a festival in Hyde Park a few years ago, and some guys were, coming on to her, but doing it in quite an aggressive way. She was very clear she wasn't interested. Next thing she realises that one of the guys has taken a photo up her skirt of her crotch and is passing it around this gang of guys. She managed to grab the phone off one of them, ran over to the security guard, they called the police, and the police says, well, actually, this isn't actually against the law, so there's nothing we can do about it. Wiped the photo, gave it back to the guy, and they carried on with their evening. And she couldn't believe that there was nothing that could be done. Apparently, it has been a law against the law in Scotland for 10 years, but it wasn't illegal in the UK. In England and Wales. And she realised she was so angry that she just needed to do something about it. And she presents this, she said, I'm just an ordinary person, I'm not particularly academic, but I just couldn't let this rest. I had to act. And so she started this campaign, drew in other people who were interested, a male ally, a guy who was a very good legal and political campaigner. And with the support of many other people, they got the law changed so that it is now illegal. So she was a great example of me, of somebody who just decided to take action rather than letting it pass, and use the resources that she had, and made something happen and stuck with it. And was also willing to be visible. And she showed a sample of some of the comments she'd received on social media, which were vile. And I thought, there's something about that courage of being willing to stick your head above the parapet, knowing that you probably will receive that sort of abuse, and being willing to not be silenced by that.
It's really difficult, isn't it? Because you know that can affect you. It can affect your family. It is an extremely brave and courageous thing to do, actually, to as you say, to stick your head above it, knowing that you will potentially get that sort of reaction.
And I'm not saying that that's advocating that for everybody. I think it's finding the thing that we're called to do, and then doing it. And it will be different for each of us what is scary and what is we can take within our stride. But I think finding those edges, and I noticed in me after last week's news, there's a part of me that didn't really want to engage with it, because it's like we've been here before so many times, and it's almost a bit like, well, it's just another one, but in a way she may be the George Floyd of sexual violence against women, the straw that breaks the camel's back. Which
is very sad that that's been the case, but sometimes you very sadly have to have catalysts, as you say, that prompt action in different ways. Just asking a question back in the workplace. I've often had friends that have been senior women in businesses and have often been challenged. I mean, we all know that there are perhaps still unfortunately limited places on executive boards for women. But often they have been women who have been quite strong and vocal, just thinking about this piece around having a voice and putting your head above the parapet in the workplace sometimes, and often being told they've been difficult, and actually sometimes just being moved out of the business slowly because perhaps the men in the board and the executive teams didn't really want to be challenged by a woman, and they're seen as difficult. Have you come across this aspect, and in these conversations you've had with Together Team, has that come up?
Yes, it's certainly come up in the work we do with the women-only work we do with Purpose, Power, Presence, and I think it's a real challenge for women in terms of how can you lead and get into positions of power where you can influence the culture of the organisation and not feel that you have to compromise yourself so much and become one of those alpha heroic leaders to succeed. And I think this is where I feel this is where taking women out of those environments and bringing them together is incredibly powerful, because together they see it's like the goldfish can't see the water they're swimming in. It's hard to see it when you're in it, but when you have a break from it and have some perspective on it, you can see, okay. Because so often what I see is that women make themselves wrong for things that really are problems within their context and system. So I think that awareness is really key. Then I think the solidarity of other women. And what I see is a younger generation of women who, and I think that's where I get a lot of hope, who aren't willing to do it in the same old ways, just as millennials in general are challenging lots of things about work culture. And it's like, well, why should I slave away, round the clock for something that doesn't actually seem intrinsically that important to me? So I think women are challenging some of the old heroic models of leadership and looking and saying, I can still be powerful and have an impact, and it doesn't mean I have to metaphorically put my shoulder pads on and I can be embodied, I can have my feelings, I can be empathic, and be a powerful leader, an influential leader as well.
And I mean, we've got a long way to go still on that, and for more women to be in positions of senior leadership positions. And I guess there's a hope there, but there's also a concern that also, and I read this recently, and I think it was a Harvard piece, that there are more women actually deciding not to stay in corporate roles, but to go out on their own and to run their own businesses, because A, they're more creative, but B, they have a greater sense of freedom, a greater sense of voice, and probably a greater sense of influence. And I think that would be a real shame, because the danger in that is then that we perpetuate what already is in the corporate world.
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, as one of those women who stepped out early on of organisations and and set up on my own, I can certainly see the appeal of it. And it's really important that there are women, and and some people just love organisations and thrive in them. And I think I wasn't. I needed it for a certain stage in my career to learn how they work, but I didn't really want to stay in them. I like dipping in and out of them. So I think it's finding what's right for each of us. And I agree with you. I think it's important that there are women who stay in there and influence them from within as well.
Brilliant. Thanks, Liz. And I think just lastly, before we close, what are the one or two things that for you, not just, as I say, the events the last week, there's a catalyst, but all the work that you're doing at the moment with a Purpose, Power, Presence and Team Together. What are the couple of things that I suppose are really galvanizing you at the moment personally? And how do you see those, I suppose, beginning to evolve, emerge, reshape and help women and men to transform?
Yeah, I think we're seeing a real convergence of so many issues at the moment, and particularly around the environment, our relationship with the earth, and whether we can establish a harmonious relationship with earth. And I used to see gender issues as somehow separate to that, and now I see that it's all part of the same thing. So when we work on the issues between men and women and rebalancing that and creating more harmonious relationships where each of us can express the whole of who we are, our doingness and our beingness, then that's all part of creating more harmonious relationship with nature as well, and minimizing the numbness which allows the destructive behaviour that we're seeing at the moment, both in terms of between genders, but also in terms of how we relate to the earth. So I feel a real urgency about this. I think it's really important work to be doing.
It's not called Mother Earth for nothing, is it?
Absolutely. And a key way of doing that is connecting with our bodies and having daily bodily practices, because our bodies are part of Mother Earth as well. They are our direct relationship with Mother Earth. And one of the things that's happened in sort of alpha normal organisations, it's all become about the head and about thinking, about analysis, and we minimise and devalue the wisdom of our bodies, of our feelings, of our intuition, all of these other ways of knowing. So, and creating dialogue spaces that honour and allow those as well, where people can talk about their feelings, they can name what's their physical embodied responses are to situations, they can share their intuitions, is part of that rebalancing and healing as well.
It's really interesting you say about that. I mean, I've found with the horse work that I do, equine human development, the difference that I see, and I know people have shared with me that they've experienced and part of their transformation, personal growth, when you connect the head and the heart and the gut, particularly the gut around intuition and that inherent inner knowing, the difference of how they then go back into the workplace and lead is incredible, because you suddenly realize, it's not, I think the brain is something like, delivers 5% of our problem solving. And, the wonderful theory of, our ability to just let go of, trying to solve the problem and just allow and trust what is to emerge. And then, you come back up the you with this wonderful sense of creativity, which is where innovation and all those great pieces that we all need in the workplace. That piece is so important now. And that does speak so well to, I think, the link back to nature, doesn't it? And that trusting and listening to what what the natural world can tell us and what we can learn from is huge.
Yes, absolutely, yes. And one of the things I do is work with the seasons very consciously. So noticing what's happening in the different seasons, and you can use it as a fantastic business planning and creative cycle tool as well. So these gifts are all around us if we just pause and notice.
In fact, yes, you and I were talking about the seasons because we were talking about Qigong, weren't we, when we first had a conversation, because I know that's some practice that you use, and I'm just doing teacher training on Qigong, because I found moving from yoga, which was quite, as I've got older, the strength of yoga doesn't really work for me. I've got some spinal discs, whereas Qigong, with the flow, and particularly with Qigong, you're very much using this idea of infinity. And the figure of 8 and the flow, I think, is very important. So back to nature again, I think there are some really good practices, as you say, practices with the body that can actually help us retrain ourselves in the way we approach life and work. It's fascinating, isn't it, when we start, as you say, integrating all this thinking.
Yeah. The history really of patriarchy is about domination and control of nature. We create safety and security by controlling nature, and we've taken that to its ultimate extreme. And now we need to dismantle that story, put it to bed, and work in partnership, in harmony with nature, and recognise that we are part of it, not separate and superior to it, which is the story we've been told, for hundreds and thousands of years.
The same with the relationships with men and women, isn't it? That sense of oneness, and finding that and rebalancing that. I think is really important, or finding balance, should we say. Liz, thank you so much. It's been really, really interesting to chat to you. And I look forward to our second part of the podcast, which we will then focus more on the work that you're doing around power, presence and purpose. And I'm looking forward to both of us sharing, I think, our own experiences with that work, particularly with our coaching and leadership work. So I'm very much looking forward to that. Thank you very much, Liz.
Me too.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation today, and if you'd like to listen to more conversations with inspiring women, do look at our website, rockmyage.com, or register to have them delivered direct to your inbox.